What is up, everybody? This is Josh, and today we're talking about Supreme Darkness. That set is going to come out next week. Sneak previews are happening this weekend, and I'm here to tell you what these new cards are going to do to the Yu-Gi-Oh metagame. First things first, we're going to get some context and talk about some of the existing decks and how they will change or fare in this new format, because the Supreme Darkness set really feels more like a DLC slash add-on to the format. It's not going to flip the format on its head, but honestly, I feel like it just adds a little bit of new stuff to it, which is kind of refreshing. It's hard for me to catch up with the amount of comments I get on these videos, but if there's anything missing, feel free to leave it down in the comments down below. I'll try to answer your questions on where these decks stand in the upcoming format. Without further ado, hope you enjoy the video. Hope it's helpful. If it is, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments down below what you're most excited about in Supreme Darkness. Let's get started. After some feedback for the last tier list, I have changed some of these categories to give a little bit of a better idea of what I expect from these decks. Very strong choices, so these are the obviously like best decks of the format. We've got good choices, which are still very solid and can definitely top or win tournaments. We've got viable options, which are just good solid decks that you can play if you want to and do well with if you have a solid day. Uphill battle, you are putting yourself at a slight disadvantage if you pick those decks over the ones up here. And then there's going to be a category for decks that I just wouldn't recommend playing if you're trying to have competitive success. Something like Ritual Beast, and this is going to be a card that is going to be relevant for some decks today. Molcharmy Meowls, or whatever it's called in the TCG, is going to be a threat to some of these decks. The question is, how popular is that card going to be? I think Ritual Beast is going to be basically the bottom of the barrel for me for the viable category. I do think the Ritual Beast deck is good. I think it's a powerful deck that could top if someone like plays it really well. You do have major issues with Molcharmy Purulia, Huvalos, and Meowls now, so like no matter what Molcharmy your opponent decides to put in your deck and throw at you, you're gonna have problems. You do have some issues with Nibiru as well, which is a popular card as of now, and I do think it's going to remain a popular card after the new set. This is like the baseline bottom of viable options. Centurion, same thing. I don't think Centurion does anything particularly well, but I also don't think it's particularly bad at anything. It's a deck that like can perform. I wouldn't call it a good choice. It's just like right down in the middle. You know, you've got like solid immunity to Molcharmies. You don't care that much about your opponent's Bestials. It's just solid viable option, I think. We've got Memento, which I think is a little underrated right now, although the Maliss matchup going second, I think is tough for this deck. Memento is, I think, typically a more board breaker deck than really a solid hand trap deck. That doesn't seem like Memento's kind of thing. It is okay into cards like Molcharmies. It's not great into cards like Shifter, which the Maliss deck can play. I think Memento remains a viable option in Supreme Darkness format, though it is a pretty good deck in the OCG right now as well, so maybe I'm even underestimating it or underselling it with this. If you're a skilled pilot with this deck, it's probably even in good. In no matter which shape or form, the Fiendsmith cards are going to be a very strong option, whether that is Fiendsmith cards in Maliss, Fiendsmith cards in Ryzeal, Fiendsmith cards in Tenpai even is something that people are doing. The pure deck is not really seeing as much representation right now, which is fair enough because people are playing a lot of Bestials, and if you play a mono Fiendsmith deck, you're gonna struggle a lot into the Bestials. But the reason why the Ryzeal cards are good with the Fiendsmith cards as well is because you have extra pushes so that one or two Bestials don't completely take you out of the game. The Fiendsmith engine, though, I think is format defining, and it will stay that way after Supreme Darkness. Anything Fiendsmith related is going to be a very good choice, and I think a major deal in this upcoming format is which decks can play the Fiendsmith cards the best and also outgrind other Fiendsmith grind games and win those. Tenpai, I'm very split on because there's basically two ways to play Tenpai now. You can still play Tenpai in the old-fashioned way where you just like play a pure Tenpai deck basically and just blind second with board breakers or hand traps or both. That deck I don't think is that good right now, also not having a whole lot of success. The deck that I do see being played and do see some success from is the Tenpai Fiendsmith variant. A lot of people are going first with that deck. It's basically pure Fiendsmith because pure Fiendsmith doesn't really play a normal summon if you don't play 3 Lacrimas. They are playing a Tenpai and Bestial package for like a normal summon that makes seals and some grind game with Bestials, and just overall like it seems to be a very grindy Fiendsmith variant that adds a normal summon to the deck, which I think is a good deck. I think that's a good choice moving forward. Pure Tenpai, I'm not a big fan of. Chimera, actually there's two decks here in Chimera and Yubel where on the one hand I haven't played them myself in a while, but on the other hand hand, I also don't really understand exactly why these decks are not being played just a little bit more. From my perspective, for example, I don't think the Yubel deck is much worse than the Maliss deck in the things that it does, right? Like if Yubel goes first, it wins the game. If Yubel goes second, it struggles. The same is true for Maliss. I guess Maliss gets to play Shifter if you want to, but I don't know like exactly why I'm not seeing anyone playing Yubel. I'm not mad at it. Don't get me wrong. Please don't play Yubel. I hate playing against Yubel, but I do think the Yubel deck is better than the current format suggests. So I think there's a chance that the Yubel deck can get like a comeback. I've always felt the same way about Chimera that I felt about Memento. Incredibly strong decks, but somehow no one is really, I mean, no one is not true, but not a lot of people are representing with those decks. The Chimera deck could very well also be a good deck. There is some support in Supreme Darkness for it. It's just that I haven't personally played with it in this current format, so I can't really tell you. But I can imagine that the Chimera deck could beat a Ryzeal board. Like the Chimera deck has very, very strong pushes. I wouldn't underestimate Memento, Chimera, and Yubel. They are at minimum viable options. They could even become better than that post Supreme Darkness, depending on what decks are viable and how they fare into those particular decks. These three are more like definitely the upper end of viable options, and these two are the lower end of viable options. With these two, it might be closer to an uphill battle. You might be right on that. Labrynth, I think, is solid. You know what? Just to get a little bit better perspective on these, let's do it like this, because I think this is a better representation of what I've been saying. Because uphill battle does not mean these decks are bad. These decks are solid decks, but there's definitely a difference between these four and these two. Maybe I should name these differently. In my head, it made sense. I'm hoping in combination with what I'm saying, it makes sense to you guys. Anyways, my personal opinion on Maliss is it is a notch under the Ryzeal deck. Personally, I think there's a lot of things about the Maliss deck that would make me rather play Ryzeal from a competitive perspective. It does suffer from Lancea, which is a big issue. It also suffers from the new Molcharmy. If people play that, I will say take that one with a grain of salt, because I don't know exactly how popular the new Molcharmy is going to be. I personally am considering it as a side deck option, but I'm not sure how many people will actually go the length of playing Hubelos, Lancea, and Meowls for the Maliss matchup, but I could see some people doing it. It's a viable option, and that's a little bit of a problem for Maliss because you can still combo under the new Molcharmy, but it does get significantly less broken if you get hit with it on your first Maliss card, especially because if they start with Dormouse, they can probably play with one summon from Banish, or maybe two. But if they start with the field spell or with the White Rabbit, it's significantly harder, and you're ending on a much weaker end board. Fiendsmith Ryzeal is still going to be the deck to beat, is my personal prediction for Supreme Darkness format. The thing that changes for Ryzeal is Eclipse Twins. It's an Exceed monster, a rank 4, that you're almost never going to summon. You are going to send it for X Ryzeal, and it says if it's sent to the graveyard, you can target 2 other Exceeds in your grave, summon one of them, and attach the other one to it as material. The reason why that's huge for Ryzeal is because you're going to attach it to Detonator instead of Mereologic Aggregator. The reason why that's so powerful is because it makes your Aggregator so much harder to out. Not your Aggregator, your Detonator. For example, the interaction with Triple Tactics Talents. If you're ending on a Detonator and your opponent activates Talents to take it, what used to happen, your opponent changed Detonator and pops itself so that you don't get it. And then it goes to the graveyard and you've outed the Detonator with Talents. And if they had any other monsters, you even get to take those. With Eclipse Twins, what's going to happen is because the Detonator and the Eclipse Twins are going to hit the graveyard at the same time in that instance, Eclipse Twins can bring the Detonator back and attach the Duo Drive to it as material, and then the Detonator gets to attach another card because that effect is on special summon. So you're basically getting a 2 material Detonator back if your opponent tries to out it. The thing is, this whole interaction, this whole Eclipse Twins card, it benefits pure Ryzeal a lot more than Fiendsmith Ryzeal for a lot of different reasons. Fiendsmith Ryzeal, the way it's currently being played, often doesn't even go for the Duo Drive anymore. For example, my recent regional list doesn't even play Duo Drive anymore. But the problem is, if you don't go through Duo Drive, you cannot use the Eclipse Twins because the Eclipse Twin cannot attach itself. It's got to be 2 other Exceeds. So if you're not going through Duo Drive, you can't really set up the Eclipse Twins in that fashion. The thing with that is that going for Duo duo drive has disadvantages. You make yourself a little weaker to certain hand traps, and also extra deck space is a big issue for Fiendsmith Ryzeal. If you're gonna have to put back in the duo drive and the Eclipse Twins, you're gonna suffer from losing other options. At that point, you're probably forced to not play the second Requiem anymore, which makes your Fiendsmith engine a lot more vulnerable to something like a Bestial. So it's not a strict positive for Fiendsmith Ryzeal to get the Eclipse Twin access to the deck. People are still going to play that. Fiendsmith Ryzeal with Eclipse Twin and Duo Drive is going to be a top tier deck, but in my opinion, the Eclipse Twins is a much stronger buff to like pure Ryzeal variants than it is to Fiendsmith Ryzeal. Almost no one is playing pure Ryzeal because everyone is just favoring the Fiendsmith variant. It feels like the Fiendsmith cards solve some problems for Ryzeal the deck had before Supreme Darkness. For example, you get more pushes, slightly stronger end board because you add a Caesar to it, and you get some grind game. With Ryzeal, pure Ryzeal now, Eclipse Twins gives you some of those things. You do get access to a stronger end board because your detonator is harder to out. You also get follow-up because the Eclipse Twins is crazy follow-up for a pure Ryzeal deck that has room for multiples of it in the extra deck, because the pure Ryzeal deck often plays 2 copies of Eclipse Twins. Because another thing you can do on turn 2, if you've used the first Eclipse Twin on turn 1, you can send an Eclipse Twin for X Ryzeal and also get its effect and bring back a detonator at the start of your second turn. I think Eclipse Twins, instead of just making Fiendsmith Ryzeal incredibly broken and so much more powerful than everything else, I think it has the effect of giving you some extra reasons to actually play pure Ryzeal over Fiendsmith Ryzeal, which in some ways is just going to lead to people still playing Ryzeal. You know, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Ryzeal is going to be the best deck and the most played deck in the upcoming format, but it does offer some variety in the sense that I don't think you're going to be playing against exclusively Fiendsmith Ryzeal only. I do think the pure Ryzeal deck gets a lot more footing from the Eclipse Twins. That being said, that's the environment that these new decks are joining us. Now, this is not every single archetype that's getting support in Supreme Darkness, but I think it's the more notable ones. I feel like people have been asking me about these the most. In this environment of Fiendsmith Ryzeal, Tenpai Fiendsmith, and Maliss, and some of these other viable options, how do these new decks fare? The support for Azamina and White Forest is good. However, I think that it's not quite enough for me to consider it a top tier deck. I think for that, it needs the last wave in Alliance Insight. Maybe it's just me being like spoiled, quote unquote, because I already know the cards that they get in Alliance Insight. I don't think the new support is bad. I do think it could catapult like Azamina, White Forest into a viable strategy already post Supreme Darkness for sure. I don't see much reason to play that deck over something like Ryzeal at the moment from a competitive perspective. Of course, if you just enjoy it more, that's a good reason to play it. We're probably looking at a top meta threat post Alliance Insight. Post Supreme Darkness, though, is a little bit of a different story. I included Argostars because I think it's a very fun concept. If you don't know Argostars, it's a deck that focuses around continuous traps that like summon themselves out of the spell trap zone, and then you can return them to the spell trap zone by doing some stuff. It's a very cool concept and has like a very control-y and grindy aspect to it. I really enjoyed the idea of that sort of deck being a good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. However, from the first wave of support, I do not think it's a working concept yet. Basically, reverse Centurion. You know what? I've never looked at it from that perspective, but you're not entirely wrong. You can definitely mess around with it at locals and maybe do okay with it, but from a competitive perspective, I wouldn't recommend the Argostars yet, unfortunately. I've seen a surprising amount of hype around Crystron. Like, people that I actually think are very, very good players have been messing around with Crystron and telling me, hey, that's a viable deck for the upcoming format. I haven't personally messed around with it too much. I've looked into some combos. It looks strong. I haven't looked into it to the point of evaluating its like qualities of being able to play around something like Nibiru, or how well does it play into hand traps in general, how good does it break boards going second, but it feels like a deck that actually has some solid combo lines to it. Yeah, it does have some showings in the OCG, so I do think at the very minimum the new Crystron deck is going to be a viable option. There's a very realistic chance it ends up being a good option. I'm gonna throw it in the top of viable simply simply because I don't feel comfortable telling you that for sure it's going to be good, but it does look promising. Now, the evil hero support is interesting in some ways and disappointing in other ways, at least from what I've seen. I think the problem with the new hero support is while they are good cards, it doesn't solve any of the existing problems for like the hero decks that is stopping those decks from performing at a competitive level. For example, like the inherent weakness of that deck to Nibiru and stuff like that. To my knowledge, the evil hero cards don't really offer any help in that regard. It just feels like the evil hero cards just offer you new end board pieces and stuff like that. That is not really what heroes need. I feel like heroes already has a plethora of really powerful end board pieces. Like you look at Dark Law, you look at Plasma, even DPE. The hero deck doesn't have a problem finding different options for its end board. It needs more consistent ways to get there and more ways to like play through hand traps and more ways to play going second. None of that really is offered by the new evil hero support. So I don't think it's going to make the hero deck any better than what it is right now, but it also obviously doesn't make it worse. It's just like an alternative way to play the deck at a very similar power level, I feel like. We've got the deck that I actually am the most hyped for, I think, out of Supreme Darkness for now. I think Primite is a very promising engine, and it receives a very powerful card in Primite Ether Beryl Dragon. This is worth mentioning because this card actually got a secret buff. If this card's normal summoned, you can set a Primite spell trap from your deck. You can only use each of the following effects once per turn. Tribute this card, send a normal monster from your deck to the graveyard. During the standby phase, if you have a normal monster in your field or graveyard, you can add this card from the graveyard to the hand. The way this card originally was translated from the OCG was that it only added itself back during your standby phase. The reason why that makes a big difference is because you can add this card back from the graveyard immediately after you've played with it on turn 1 during your opponent's standby phase, giving you an extra card in hand for certain interactions, whatever. Like if you have a Forbidden Droplet in your deck, you have an extra send. If you have any card that requires a discard, you have a free discard. If you have Primite Drill Beam that requires you to reveal a Primite card in order to use it, now you have a guaranteed way to get a Primite card into your hand in order to activate Primite Drill Beam, which is negate a card on the field and banish it, which is a really powerful quick play spell if you have a Primite card in your hand, which previously you couldn't really guarantee that unless you went out of your way to add another Primite card from your deck to your hand. If you go for any Primite combos, you wouldn't have a Primite card at the end of your turn. So now with the Primite Beryl Dragon adding itself back to your hand during your opponent's standby phase immediately, you have a card to reveal for Drill Beam, and that makes this card a lot better. All those things being said, the reason why I'm looking forward to Primite is because Primite doesn't even need this sort of buff to be a relevant engine. People have already been playing Primite in both OCG and TCG. In the OCG currently, the Primite engine is part of one of the most represented decks in the game, which is Primite Blue Eyes, which is a deck that we won't have right off the bat. Even in other aspects, the Primite cards have seen play. People have been messing around in the TCG with something like Primite Fiendsmith, where you bring out White Dust on with the Primites because you can summon any vanilla in the game. I'm predicting that there's going to be ways to use the Primite engine, whether that is waiting for Primite Blue Eyes or putting it into other decks, Primite Fiendsmith, whatever. Whether that's better than Ryzeal or Maliss remains to be seen, but I do attest a lot of potential to the Primite engine. I think it's going to be very strong. At the very minimum, with the Blue Eyes structure deck, we're going to look at a top tier meta threat, in my opinion. I have sworn to never cope on TCG exclusives ever again. However, in the case of Mitsurugi, I don't even have to cope on it because other people are doing it for me. I'm not here to tell you that I think Mitsurugi is going to be crazy because I'm not sure. However, everyone else is just screaming at me that like Ryzeal Mitsurugi is apparently a thing because like Ryzeal is able to make a rank 4, which makes King of the Feral Imp, which searches all the Mitsurugi cards because they're reptiles. The ritual spell admittedly does have a pretty broken concept. You have to either have the ritual in hand and then you contribute to things from your deck for cost, or you have to have the cost in hand and then you can ritual summon from your deck. So it's a pretty neat concept. However, I have my doubts that that's going to be better than the other meta decks in the format right now. I'm going to put it into a viable option because I've looked into it before this stream. I've looked at some of the deck lists that people have posted online. I've looked at some of the things that the deck does. It's definitely not bad. And if you want to play it, you can, which is good. It's a good thing for a TCG exclusive archetype because like there is a way to play it right off the bat. It's not like one of those decks where you're going to have to desperately wait for the second wave and then get disappointed by it and so on and so forth. This is already a very above average result for a TCG exclusive archetype, that there is a viable way to play it right off the bat. The new Tenyi support I thought looked pretty cool when I read it for the first time. However, I have my doubts that it is like hugely impactful on the format. I do think like Sword Soul Tenyi and Pure Tenyi and stuff like that, they're gonna be playable. You're still fighting an uphill battle. Rank Meteorreactor or I Riot. See, the thing is, this is what they're listing in terms of gets new archetypes here. Like, look at how many decks theoretically get new support. I will say that for most of the things that now we haven't really mentioned, like the Gladiator Beasts of this world or the Meteorreactor of this world, I just don't feel like the new support gives them sufficient meta relevance. The Gladiator Beast support, for instance, I just think misses the mark. I do think Gladiator Beast is one of those decks. With the way how modern Yu-Gi-Oh works, you're never going to replicate the feeling of playing a Gladiator Beast deck, because Gladiator Beast is so focused around like the battle phase. You're so focused around like trying to connect attacks and then returning them to the deck. That's how Gladiator Beast used to work. That is just a concept that in modern Yu-Gi-Oh wouldn't really work. They're just giving them custom cards to turn them into a different deck, which I personally am not a huge fan of. And it's not even doing a really good job at that. You know, there's certain legacy decks that would potentially work in a new setting, and then there's some decks where their concept is just so outdated that it's probably better to leave it in the past. That is how I view the upcoming format with Supreme Darkness. Once again, I don't think Supreme Darkness is going to shake up the format in a crazy way. I do think Ryzeal and Maliss and Fiendsmith are still going to be the driving forces of this upcoming format. The new decks just kind of like slot right in there. There's nothing that completely takes over. However, there are viable things in this set. Decks that are going to be viable options and with some testing and some cooking and some good performance can definitely surprise people. White Forest Azamina, Crystron, Mitsurugi, Primite engines, that sort of stuff like is definitely interesting, and I think saying that Supreme Darkness doesn't bring anything to the format is an underestimation. Supreme Darkness might actually end up being more of like a sleeper set. Like in the beginning, people are going to underestimate it, but in the long term, I think it's got some pretty good stuff in it. Let me know what you think in the comments down below if you've been watching on YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hope it is helpful to you guys preparing for your upcoming sneaks and all that kind of stuff, helping you to decide which kind of decks you want to pick up and look into. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.